Today we're going to talk about primary key integrity. You might recall that there's three types of integrity that relational databases have. There's primary key integrity, there's domain integrity, and there's referential integrity. And we use constraints to maintain all of these types of integrity. So today we'll talk about primary keys. Um, Recall what a table is a collection of items or of objects. They all have the same properties. Okay. And the only way we can tell these items apart is if there's a value or a column, a property with never change that's always unique for every item in the collection, right? If it also is unique, it can never be blank, right? Because if it's blank, you can't find that record. If two records have the same value for all their properties, you can't tell them apart, right? So for us to be able to distinguish between each individual record or each individual item, there has to be a column, or at least one column, one property that's never null, that's never blank, and always unique. And that column is called, we call, or we will tend to, sometimes people will call it a primary key. Okay. The primary key is a little bit different from that column. Okay, because the primary key is property. It's almost like a pointer or something like that. Okay. So the way we maintain, why do we have to have these columns? Remember, one of the properties of a table of a relation is that every row is unique, right? And that we should be able, and so to make sure every row is unique, we have to have at least one column that's always unique, not null. Okay, and to maintain that, we place a restriction on that, so that that column or those columns are never dropped or altered, and you can't delete things in or change things in them. So the primary key is really just a command or SQL statement which will enforce that integrity. Okay. Sometimes you'll hear people saying this is a primary key column. Okay. And we understand what they mean, but there isn't really a primary key column. What I mean is that, if you have a door, right, you can put the same lock on different doors. Okay. So you can also go and change the lock, but still use different keys. Um, it's more like you can also increase or decrease the number of columns that will be used to find or refer to or each individual row or record in the table. I'm making this distinction because there's something very subtle going on here, that there isn't necessarily a primary key column. There's a column that has a primary key constraint imposed on it. That's a distinction I'm trying to make, right? And generally, once you impose a primary key, so you might be able to impose a primary key constraint on a column that already exists. If you do that, it's going to make sure everything in that column is always unique and also never null. And I also do what? Prevent that column from being dropped. So you can also impose it on many. Now, if you look at the notes here, the syntax, you'll see that there's dot, dot, dot. That means that you can't just write this by itself, okay? You have to, this is included with something else. It's inside something else. Generally, there's two ways you can do this. You're going to declare the primary key constraint inside a new table when you're creating a table, or you will impose a primary key constraint on a table that already exists. But let's look at the syntax. See, as constraint, we write the keyword constraint, followed by a constraint name, primary keyword, and then inside these braces, the number of columns we want to impose the constraint on. So if you look, you can have you can have at least one or as many columns are in the table. Okay? So, and you might be wondering where this comes from. If I go back to what is a table and I go to generic constraint syntax, you'll see this is a generic constraint syntax over here. Alter table, add constraint, constraint name, constraint type, constraint definition. I didn't want to cover this much more because each constraint is defined a little bit differently. But if you go to section 6.7, you can get some idea. Now let's go back here to primary key integrity. So how do we create? So we've seen this. This section talks about how with it in a table. And you see over here that we're using what? Primary key, right? That's it. That's one way you can do it. The reason why I don't like doing it that way is sometimes you want to be able to use a constraint name. And if you name things explicitly, it's so much easier to work with. If you look at this second example, what did they do? They gave the constraint a name. So I'm going to go back to to SQL and the example we're working on. Remember, we're working on the customers table. So what I'm going to first do is I'm going to drop these tables. So I'll run through this. And something you'll see people doing. And I'll introduce it here. I'll do this if object ID, and I'll put customer.customers. And what type of thing is this? This is a table, so it's U is not null. Drop table customer.customers. Okay, why do I do this? It's just so much easier that I'm going to be using this for testing and playing. So I just put this code in here. And the nice thing about this is if a table exists, it will drop it. If it doesn't, it won't drop it. That's what this is doing. And you'll see this a lot when testing code. So what else will I do? I might also want to drop this anyway because I don't like that name representatives. It's long and unwieldy. What would be a better name? Let me change it to customer dot liaison. I think I spelled that correctly because this is a customer's liaison, right? And let me look up, make sure because I always want to use plural, let me look up plural of liaison. Okay, it's up in my browser. Liaisons. So Control C, Alt Tab, and I'll just change it here. So you see, sometimes I'm looking for things that are shorter. I think I already dropped that. So now you see what I'll do. Control C, Control V, and I'll just change this to Control C, Control V, Control V. And please take note of how I use white space. So I'll put over here. So you see I can take this away, can't I? And I'll say over here, a comment. And I'm not writing a whole lot in the comments. You can see, I think, with a comment that you can, I'm just trying to describe it very simply. And you see that whenever I put a line comment, the code follows immediately after. I don't put a space between that, but I'm putting spaces between the things that are new, right? So then I'll take this, Control V, and I'll change this to invoices. And I'll probably make another table now. Probably invoice items. So oops, Control Z. So I've made these tables, and you see I can now take, and I'm going to put something up else over here. If schema ID customer is not null, what I want to do is drop schema customer, right? So now and I'll put in here what the database is. Use database. Actually, I just use use test. Go. Right, so what's the nice thing about this? I should be able to run this so let me try running it and see what it does. Hopefully I won't get any errors. Click out. So you see it's referencing, that's why. But so what I'll do is if schema is null, let me change it this way. So you say, okay, I'll have to look this up later. I forgot how to do that. I'll just put, so I only want to create the schema if it doesn't exist. That's simpler. Let me just put Control Z, put everything back, and I will put a block comment to comment this whole thing out. And when I put a block comment like this, I'll indent it so you can see very easily. All right, so now let's run this and see what it does. And I'm running this more to test. So you see it, I can't find. So if I click on this error message, it takes me to that line. So you see it says I need to just replace this with what? Liaisons. Control C. Control V. And I will save this. Let me save it to customers script. And let me run it again. There. Okay, now we've done this. I can now use this to make some changes. So the first thing, going back to looking at this example, right? And what I could do is I don't need to copy the dots, right? Because the dots show me, it just means this has to be in something. So I'll go copy, and I'll go here, and let me make the ID the primary key constraint for the custom. So I'll go Control V, and let's make some changes so we can see how it works. I can take this away. What happens if and this is how we can learn things quickly, and I put the ID in there. Does it like that? No. Is it because of it? No. Actually, it likes this, doesn't it? And let me change a constraint name. What's a convention I use for a constraint name? Convention we like to use is table name, singular of table name, underscore PK. So I'll do what table name? So I'll go customer, Control C, Control V, underscore PK. Right. And I'll just highlight this part and let's run it and see what happens. Now take note, before I do that, let's look at customer.customers. We see this section here, right? Everything is allowed to be null. Are there any keys? No. Are there any constraints? No. So if we do this, oops, what happens? Execute. It completed successfully. Let's refresh this. What do you see now? Do you see that the ID is now says PK, not null? Do you see that? And if we go to refresh this, what do you see? There's something in there, customer PK. And if I go see something that you might find useful later, I can go here. You hope you can't see it easily. New query editor window. It shows what the code is. So you can see what did it do. If I forget what I did, I can do is it's alter table, customers, add constraint name, and over here you see the column. Okay, this other stuff we don't really need, and it says the database it's using. All right, so this also gives us an idea of what's going to happen. So I'm going to do another one. Let's go back to this, go back to the editor, and I'll do it this time. I'm going to do the ID again, and I'll just write, I won't give it a constraint, I'll just write primary key like what we see over here. And you see, I didn't say not null. I like to say not null explicitly because it's a form of error checking. Now if I write primary key, okay, let's run this and see what we get. Execute, and if I go to refresh tables and customer liaisons, and you see now it says primary key again, not null, right? But now, do you notice that's different about the name? You see, SQL gave it a name, and it has PK in front, liaisons, and it has this long series of numbers. Why does it have that long series of numbers? It's to make sure that it's unique. Okay, we won't know what that is. So, and if you need to drop this constraint or change it, it's harder to track. Okay. Remember, and something else I'll point out, everything in SQL is a table. So it's actually a table of all the constraints. Remember, everything in a table has to have, they probably said the name should be unique. Okay. And we should be able to find everything. So that's what reason what we might see some of this stuff. So we've seen how you can make a primary key in this way. And this is very similar to what we see in the notes, right? So I'll do it a second way because I happen to not like this way of writing it. Let's go to the invoices table. And what I'll do this time is I'll go comma, and I'll say, I'm going to go back to that syntax. You see how I'm using the syntax. I'll copy this, Control V, and we'll call what will be this constraint name. It will be invoice PK. Why do I use that style? If you look, there's a section here on naming conventions for primary keys. Where is it? Oh, right here. Table name underscore PK. Okay. I'm not going with plural of a table name because each record has a primary key. That's why. So some people you'll see they'll use the plural form, but I think remember this is the record's primary key. That's why I'm doing it that way. So you see I've put comma, right, constraint, and then which column? Let's put this on multiple columns. So I'm going to do it on the ID and the timestamp, and you can see timestamp is a SQL keyword because that's why it's in blue. Micros, they like to use a lot of the keywords, so I'm going to change this to transaction. Let me say complete purchase time, right? So I'll change that to, so let me make this not null. And this also not null. One reason I like to say not null explicitly, like I said, is we're not making assumptions. So I'll call this I'll use a long name, transaction completion time. Okay. I don't really like that name. I like timestamp. Actually, I'll just use timestamp. And you see, what did I do here? I'm putting the primary key constraint on 2 columns. And if we run this, let's see what happens. Now you see I'm making this constraint a separate line all by itself. And if we go to invoices, what do you see? The primary key is on 2 columns, right? And you can also see these 2 are not null. Go to keys, see there's an invoice, right? Now go create 2. Some people will like to double click on things. Like if you double click here, does it open? Oh, okay, I forget how to do it. Some people like to double click on things to see the properties. I really don't like it because it's very easy that you might, if I close it, I feel like it's easy to delete things without meaning to. Okay, so we've now put the primary key constraint on these columns. Let's see what happens if we try and drop the column. Okay, so I'm going to close this window. I will close this window and I'll go to a new query window. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go, how do we drop a column again? If you forget, what can I do? I can go in here. Actually, I'll do it this way because it's a good idea to learn how to search for things. So I'll say drop column. Let's see what it finds. You might not remember all the sections, and it's found something, I think. So I'll go next. Oh, you see it's right. This is an example, right? Alter table and table name. Let me see if there's another example. So you see is altering a column. We cannot alter. I'm adding a column, altering a column. Oh, there's dropping a column, and I'll go next line. Yeah, it's right here. So I'll just take this, right? Control C, Alt Tab, Control V, and what's the table I want to let me drop the column in customer.customers, Control C. I can't Alt Tab now because you see I'm inside this X. Control V. And I'll go back here, and which column? The ID column. Control C. You might prefer not to use to search, but the biggest thing that we're trying to do here is the SQL words, keywords, and expressions, I think are fairly. I don't think it's a good idea to cram them. You can just alter. You'll use this so many times, you'll start to learn it. All right. And instead of fumbling and figuring out how did I do this again, you can just alter and copy and paste. So let's see what happens if I try and drop this. Do you see the message? It says the object is dependent, so it fails. What does this mean? Remember, there's a primary key constraint. What does a primary key constraint prevent? If I go here, oops, it prevents columns of a primary constraint being altered or dropped, right? There's no data in there, so we won't deal with the deletion or updated right now. So you see, that's what it does. Let me try dropping a column that doesn't have that. So I'll say street address. And let's see what happens. I don't need to highlight it since it's the only thing. It worked. You see that? So we've now seen the impact of a primary key, how it prevents stuff from being changed, how it maintains the integrity. Okay, back to the notes. So now over here they talk about something called identity property. What's identity property used for? Frequently, we might want to, if we want to make sure a column is always has unique values inside it and is never null, it's helpful to auto-generate the values. And we can use identity property to auto-generate values. This is something that Microsoft borrowed from Oracle. And identity property, it can be used it's good for generating numbers. We can't use it to generate characters. Okay, so if we use identity, you can also use it for floats, or for approximate numbers, but it's best used for whole numbers. So integers, longs, stuff like that. And how does it work? You'll see, again, you see that this is a syntax for it. Dot dot means you don't write identity by itself. It has to be included with something, generally with a column. Okay, you apply identity to a column, and you'll have a seed, what you'll start with, and what you'll increment by. Something else about identity property is you cannot put the identity property on a column that already exists. It has to be a new column. So if you want to use identity, you're going to have to, you might have to drop a column and add it back. So let's see how to use identity. Because again, with identity, if you use it, it's going to automatically generate the number. You don't have to worry about what the value is. And with identity, it's going to make sure it's unique. So, and over here they talk about big int, and we can also change a value, but we'll skip that for now. So what I'm going to do First, let's go over here to this table now. And let's say, so let me go to this. Let's see if we can apply the identity column to this column, which is varchar. So I'll say identity when, right? And what's it saying? You see, it doesn't like that. It says incorrect syntax. So if I highlight it, it's going to fail. I know it's going to fail. You see that? So remember I said that you have to drop a column. You can't put it on a column that already exists. The error message doesn't tell you that. So what I can do is I'll just copy this, Control C, Control V, and I'll change this to what? Drop. And let me put a semicolon there and run this first. See, it's dropped. Let's run this. What happens? See, it still doesn't like it, right? It's not telling us really why. So what I'm going to do is I will take this identity away. And run those two again. Oops. So you see, it's doing things sequentially. So let me take that away. Run that. Oh yes, it doesn't exist. So let me just run this all over. Yeah. Okay. Now the next thing I want to do, let's find an example where I can use identity. So if we look here, which cart table? So you see customer invoices, right? Not as an int. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change alter table customer invoices, new query, alter table customer dot invoices, alter column ID, and I'll say int still, and I'll say not null, and I'll go identity. And let's see, and this isn't, you see it doesn't like this. So what's the problem? If I comment out identity and run it, actually worked this time. So you see, I can't put it on a column that already exists. But let's say I drop the column. So I'll go in here, Control C, Control V, drop, and I take that away. Oh. Oops, I had a typo. So I run this now. Actually, let me first undo that, because I was making a claim and you see I had a typo. So I'll run this, execute, so it doesn't like that. But now if I change add, and I run this one first, execute, alter table, what am I doing wrong? Oh, okay, I'll just copy this, Control C. Control V, drop column, ID, run that, execute. See, this is what it's expecting. It will fail because there's a primary key constraint, right? So what's the first thing I need to do? I need to first drop that constraint. How do I drop a constraint? I'll go to the notes. If I've forgotten how, I can go in the notes and say drop primary key constraint. Now, I might not find something about that because there isn't a specific thing about dropping a primary key constraint. It's searched. See, there's nothing. But if I say constraint, I think there's a typo there. This is the code, right? So let's copy this line, Control C, Alt Tab, if I've forgotten. But now I know it's customer invoices, so I'll go up here, Control V, Control C, Control V, and what's going to be the format of Control V? I know that it's going to be invoice PK, hopefully, right? Yes, it's invoice PK. So I go here, and then I run these two. Oops. Execute. See, that worked. Now let's see what happens if I do this. Execute. Now what's the problem? Oh, typo. Identity. So let's try this again. There, it works. But you might have been thinking I did something wrong, so I'm going to change this to alter column. And let's change this to 10. Man, see, it doesn't like that. And the error message isn't helpful, but let's go to invoices. Let's refresh this table. And you see there's a column, right? ID not int not null. Are there any keys? There's no keys. We're not seeing anything in here about identity, do we? So you can't see it from here, but if I was to go to, where is it? Actually, I don't like doing it this way. If I want to see how the table is defined, this is what I prefer to do. I go to script table as create to new query editor window. And you can see what it puts in there, right? So I've dropped the identity, and I'll close this window. And you can't see it right now, but so I'm going to change this back to add column, and I'll run these two again. Oh, and remember, if I'm adding a new column, I just say add. execute. Yeah. And I want to put the primary key back. So the way I can do that is I'll go add, Control C, Control V, add, and I'll say constraint. And I like to sometimes, well, I'll write it all in one line. So, and I'll say the constraint name, remember it's invoice underscore PK. And I write primary key. And what column do I want it on? The ID column. And that's it. So now if I run this and I refresh the columns here, you now see that has a primary key. And I refresh here. Oh, sorry, wrong table. I go to invoices. Refresh here. You can see the column. And I refresh here. Right. Okay. So back to the notes. And I'll go to, so you've seen an example here of how I added a primary key to an existing table. And there's examples here too. Alter table, table name, add constraint, primary key, and the between braces, the columns. What's the naming convention? You see over here I use a different naming convention. I keep making changes. I think it's consistent. I'm trying to move to what? This being singular all the time. This is how I used to do it before. I think people will get the idea. Now, what's a super key? A super key is also, it's just a primary key constraint on multiple columns. All the columns that you're going to include in the super key must be what? Each individual column must be unique, not null. I personally don't like them because you're having to guarantee each column and each record in that column is unique and not null. And so it becomes more to manage. I feel like if you're going to do that, it might be easier to just have, and especially if you don't have control of that data and have some means of generating that into, it can be just a lot to keep track of. I feel so sometimes they also call a super key a composite key. The applications I've developed, I found like I don't really like to use them. There's some applications where using a super key is a very good idea. I just haven't run into any where I've wanted to use them. The other thing I like to do is I like to make sure that my primary keys are not used in queries. They're just something used internally for the database. Okay. So I like to make them completely separate. One of the reasons one of the descriptions I've used for doing that is that I'll have two things that are unique, not null. One is a primary key, which is used internally by the database. No one ever needs to know about that. Then there's the other columns, which are also unique, not null, which are used in searches. Okay. And with that, I tend to make my primary keys always ints. Okay. Then I can use other things, can be of another data type, generally a car, and I customize that. Okay. What's another data type that we use for primary keys? I won't go over that right now because we won't be using it in this course, but we can use unique identifier and sequential ID. The nice thing about these is that you can use much larger data ranges. Ints and longs, they have a certain range. And if you have a very large table, you could probably use up all the values in an int or long. But with a unique identifier, you won't run into that problem. So you can use unique identifier. It's going to be completely random. You can also use a sequential ID, which will be faster to generate. But if you care about people guessing what the new sequential ID is going to be, it's not as secure. But we won't cover that right now. And I talked a little bit about surrogate versus natural keys. Now, what's a natural key? It's what we tend to use in searching. For example, a natural key for looking people up is the social security number. Why? Because they're unique, not null, right? Maybe for banks, it might be a routing number. It's what we'll tend to think about. And there's a surrogate key or surrogate ID, which is only used for maintaining that rule that every record should be unique, not null. I like to use surrogate keys for a primary key, or use something that's always just an int, because it's very simple. And so over here, there's an example of that being done. And that's it for the primary keys right now.